Chapters 31 and 32 of The Measure of a Man, A Tale of the Big Woods by Norman Duncan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31, In His Own Behalf. Swamp's End was amazed, of course, when it all came out, but not for long, for it seemed to Swamp's End after all, and to Bottle River, to the Cant-hook, and to the boys of the Yellow Tail too, that Pale Peter's course had been reasonable enough. Swamp's End observed with solicitous interest the swift conversion of the Red Elephant into the Donald Memorial. Nor was Swamp's End cynical in respect to the outcome, but rather watched the progress of the affair in curious and hopeful expectancy. Swamp's End regretted, to be sure, and conceived it a sinful waste when news of a certain deed in the night went abroad. It was held that to broach casks of good liquor, to shatter bottles, to spill the last drop in the cellar, was quite unnecessary to the accomplishment of Pale Peter's admirable purpose. That, though good liquor had no proper place within the four walls of the Donald Memorial, there were other ways of disposing of it. Why waste? Why not rather celebrate? Why not call the boys from the woods and initiate the undertaking in the traditional way? Wouldn't the boys come? To be sure, the boys would come. Gladly, generously, too, and John Fairmeadow might pray as much as he liked. A little conviviality need not interfere with the religious exercises. It never had before. In these strange circumstances, moreover, it might help. The boys would feel more at home in the new surroundings. Aside from this small criticism, however, the project met with the approval of the woods, and when the paper-hangers had returned to Big Rapids, and when a carload of new furniture from the East had been installed, and when the lamps were lighted once more in the transformed bar, and when the warm glow fell again from the red-curtained windows into the night, Swamp's End met the new proprietor at the threshold, and warmly shook his hand and grinned, and having inspected the comfortable place heartily reckoned that she'd do. By this time, however, Pale Peter was gone. There had come a blustering night. The late east-bound, plastered with driven snow, puffed into the station and stood still, breathing heavily. "Good-bye, Jack," said Pale Peter. "Peter," John Fairmeadow earnestly returned, "won't you stay?" "No need of me, old man. Everything's fixed. You're in full and legally determined possession of the old place. That's all I care about. Good-bye." "Peter!" "Good-bye." "Won't you stay, old man, and help?" "Oh, no, Jack. I reckon you don't need a man like me. And you know, Jack, you have a little partner remaining. You'll stand by, I know. You'll stand by him." "I'll stand by, Peter." "Good-bye." "Good-bye, old man. God bless you." So passed Pale Peter from Swamp's End, nor was he ever heard of again. But the little partner remained. The little partner remained in the spirit to bless the woods and to inspire the shepherd of its erring souls. There came presently to John Fairmeadow, busy and distracted, a politely phrased and cautious invitation to address the superior body, briefly to address the superior body, in relation to his ministerial activities in the lumber woods. John Fairmeadow was assured that the superior body was back of him in his labour for the Lord, that the superior body not only respected but prayed for him, that the brethren would be delighted to receive him, to listen to him, briefly of course, and that the brethren would doubtless be pleased to carry to their congregations news of his most interesting and peculiar work, to the end that some small sums might be raised to assist it. Wherefore, John Fairmeadow was urged to make an impression, to hit the bull's-eye, now that he had the chance to, strike while the iron was hot. He was indulgently warned, however, that the brethren were busy men, and he was tipped off in this connection that brevity would be a telling point in his favour. It was an earnest, interested, wholly agreeable letter, and John Fairmeadow was delighted with it. "Now," thought he, "that's mighty kind in the boys. It isn't what I expected to speak to them about, but I'll do my best." It will be observed that John Fairmeadow was flattered. flattered to be brought into an accepted relationship with the ordained of his profession; and doubtless John Fairmeadow, having applied his large energy and devotion to the task, would have composed a capital address, would both have hit the bull's eye and struck while the iron was hot, had not Long Butcher Long, one of his parishioners, developed delirium tremens at that inopportune moment, and needed the closest sort of attention. Worse than that, John Fairmeadow was late. The Superior Body was already in session. When Fairmeadow arrived in the anteroom of the church at the Capitol where the Superior Body was deliberating, his big hand was shaken by a diffident, white-cravated, frock-coated, pale-fingered, speckled little man, the author of the politely phrased letter, and welcomed with caution. "We're mighty glad to have you with us, Mr. Fairmeadow," said the little gentleman, his manner conveying a due sense of the honour the Superior Body had conferred upon John Fairmeadow. "That's all right, old man," Fairmeadow responded. "I'm glad, too." The little gentleman peered at John Fairmeadow over his spectacles. "The Superior Body is sorry, of course," said he, "that the outcome of your examination was unfortunate." Fairmeadow laughed. "That's all right, old man," he replied. "I'm sorry, too. So are the boys. That's why I am." "You see, Mr. Fairmeadow," the little gentleman began to stammer in apology, "we have to—" "Oh, don't mention it," said Fairmeadow. The little gentleman was ill at ease. "If I were you, Mr. Fairmeadow," he said, at last, "I shouldn't refer to the matter in my address to the brethren." "Why not?" "Well, you see, nothing would be accomplished." "No?" Fairmeadow inquired, amused. "Nothing whatsoever. The Superior Body has made up its mind. In certain cases, of course, ordination is conferred upon men of limited theological education. But these are extraordinary cases, and the Superior Body, in discussing your case, has determined, Mr. Fairmeadow, that your usefulness would not be increased by—" "Just so," Fairmeadow interrupted, "but the Superior Body knows nothing about it. In point of fact, my usefulness would be increased. My parishioners want an ordained minister. They're quite right, too. And for that reason I have sought—" "My dear fellow!" "Now," Fairmeadow went on, "I'd like to tell the boys in there—" "My dear fellow! Don't think of such a thing. Take my advice. Let the matter drop. The Superior Body has had a full and free discussion of the standard of theological training it should demand of all applicants for ordination." "Theological training?" Fairmeadow laughed. "Yes, of course," the little gentleman replied. "And in your case—" "I'll tell 'em about mine." "Theological training? You've had none." "Oh, yes, I have, old man," said Fairmeadow, confidently. "And I'm going to tell the boys in there all about it." "My dear fellow!" "That's all right, old man," said Fairmeadow, positively. "But, by Jove, I will!" When the chairman's attention was at last distracted from the discussion under way for John Fairmeadow's introduction, he managed to shake hands in a quick, soft way, and to whisper, "Glad you've come. Very busy just now. Be seated somewhere. I'll call on you in due course." Then he returned on tiptoe to his little table, and once more smilingly faced the busy meeting of the black-coated brethren. John Fairmeadow sat down to wait; to look and to listen and to marvel. The debate was prolonged and somewhat acrimonious. I have forgotten what it concerned. It was a point of order, perhaps, or it may have been the congregational squabble at Brown's Corners. I have forgotten. Perhaps it was the progress of missions among the Mohammedans of southern Arabia. This does not matter, however. It was prolonged, at any rate, and it was slightly acrimonious, so that the chairman must keep a tight rein on the brethren who were used at such times, being one family, to loose themselves somewhat from restraint. There were retort and rejoinder in plenty, some of it keen-edged, and there was a good deal of laughter, too. John Fairmeadow fidgeted in his pew. Time was passing. His train was due to leave within the hour. And Long Butcher Long, now reposing in the care of Plain Tom Hitch in the glorified snake room of the Donald Memorial at Swamp's End, would need John Fairmeadow's more knowing and more powerful attentions that night. So Fairmeadow stared and listened impatiently, and fidgeted in his pew, and wondered how much time a gathering of ordained ministers might waste with an easy conscience, and speculated upon the condition of all the parishioners who went lacking a shepherd in the meantime, and heartily wished they'd get through. At last they did, of course, and the bewildered Fairmeadow wondered what the outcome of the discussion had been. It was not surprising, for the matter had "gone over." In the midst of his effort to solve the riddle, Fairmeadow heard the smiling chairman say, "A few words from Brother Fairmeadow, reports of whose work among the degraded lumber-jacks of our state have interested us so much, and who will briefly address us." Fairmeadow rose, looked composedly around, put his hands in his pockets, squared his shoulders, and audibly sighed. Nobody knows why he sighed. I fancy that Fairmeadow himself had no idea at the time. But the sigh was so deep and frank, you may believe, that it was quite sufficient to procure attention and a curious silence in the church. There had been a good deal of talk about Fairmeadow. From many sources the brethren had learned a good deal about him. There had been a good deal of laughter, too. The examining committee had not failed to tell picturesque tales in the most humorous fashion in the world about the experience with Billy the Beast at Swamp's End. The superior body had laughed heartily at the leisure moments of the last session; and the congregations beyond, for the story was far too good to keep, embellished as it had been by the ingenuity of the examining committee, had echoed the laughter of the brethren. And Fairmeadow, now standing gravely before them all, clad in the lumber-woods way, still in mackinaw and heavy boots, was a figure good to look upon, if only on account of the admirable contrast he presented. A clean, true man, at work, hard at work, in the world; a big, broad-shouldered, deep-chested, long-legged body, evidently with a soul to match its excellencies, and with a glowing heart and a purpose lifted high. No wonder the brethren attended. It was an occurrence out of the ordinary, quite out of the ordinary, believe me. And while the big man in the mackinaw looked gravely roundabout upon them all, seeming to pause to look into the eyes of each, the brethren settled themselves to listen, stirred by an agreeable little thrill of impending excitement. The chairman repeated absently, "Will briefly address us." "Boys," Fairmeadow began, genially, in his big, warm way, "I'm almighty sorry I can't stay very long with you." A little laughter was provoked. "You see, boys," Fairmeadow went on ingenuously, "I'm a busy man, and I've got to get back on the job by the 6:43. Otherwise I'd be glad to talk to you all night." Somebody called, "Talk as long as you like." "Thanks, old man," Fairmeadow replied. "I'd like to, really, I would, but go on, go on." Fairmeadow nodded and smiled his acknowledgment of this genuine interest. "What I want to talk to you about," he began, "is something you've been a good deal bothered about, and that's my ordination." "The brother," said the chairman promptly, "is out of order." "That's all right, old man," Fairmeadow began, smiling, "but you see—" There were loud cries of, "Let him go on, brother." The chairman bowed acquiescence. The wish of the brethren was evidently unanimous, and far too fervent to be opposed. "Thanks, boys," Fairmeadow responded quietly. "That's just what I mean to do." There was a round of applause. Fairmeadow began at the beginning. "Boys," said he, so gravely that his deep voice thrilled the hearts of every man among them, "I am a redeemed drunkard. In this is my call and education, and therein resides my right to ordination." After that the silence was not once broken. The good brethren, sitting in the presence of a man who had suffered the fires of unrighteousness, listened enthralled to the story of those other days. There was not a whisper, not a movement. It was all frankly told: the tale of the Bowery saloon, of the park benches, of begging and filth and shivering nights, of hopelessness and of helpless, uttermost degradation. "And at last, boys," Fairmeadow proceeded, "I was kicked out of Solomon's Cellar and had no place to go. And I got up from a bench in Mulberry Park, boys, and was advised by two friendly fellows to go down to Jerry McCauley's mission in Water Street. Go down there, they said, and God will help you. It was raining. It was a cold, wet night in the fall of the year. I was sick and cold and on the verge of delirium tremens, and I needed a drink. I desperately needed a drink. They told me the way, I suppose. I have forgotten. And I forget all that happened until I found myself at the door of the mission in Water Street with a definite idea that I had come for a bed ticket. I had not come for religious consolation, you may be sure. Not for spiritual grace. I had come for what I could get out of it, and for what a sick drunkard needed, a bed ticket. They were singing. It chanced that they were singing a hymn my mother used to sing when I was a boy at home. I sat down, obscurely. I was drunk. It may be that I had a drink on the way to Water Street. Perhaps two. I do not know. But I was drunk, and I reasoned, benighted reason, that if I were to get my ticket, I must behave myself before all these pious folk. They were singing, "Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in Thee." And it seemed to me that I could hear my mother's voice, that I could see her face, that she was living again, that I was at home again, a boy. You understand? You know the vision that might come to such a man as I, then? Presently they sang again. It chanced, shall I say chanced, that my mother used to sing that simple hymn too when I was a boy at home. It was, "Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to thy bosom fly." And I was overcome. I had loved my mother. I had wronged her, of course, but I had never ceased to love her. Never failed in all those degraded years to cherish her memory. I had loved her. I drank her to death, God knows it, but I had loved her, God knows, loved her every hour. Fairmeadow paused. While they sang these simple hymns, he went on, presently resuming, memory of my mother stirred within me, memory of her, of home, of trees and lawn, of the touch of her hand, her prayers, her kisses, of myself as a lad, of the old aspirations, of baseball, of my bedroom, the little things of home and childhood and of a man's mother, her voice and hands and eyes. You know, don't you? Every man surely understands. The brethren understood. I had not thought much of such things for a long time, perhaps, Fairmeadow continued. I had been concerned with the pursuit of another drink. Perhaps the old hymns, these awakened memories, exhibited my degradation with conviction to my own soul. I don't know. But when one of the brothers testified, I listened. I believed him. It seemed to me that he was telling the story of my life and wretchedness, not of another's, not of his life any more than of mine. I believed him. It was true. I knew that every word was true. I knew intimately, the back room of the Bowery saloon from which he had been ejected. Others testified to redemption through Jesus Christ, to salvation from themselves and every power of evil. And I knew that they did not lie. Some gave thanks for a day's preservation, some for the ease of a week, some for years of joyous, useful life. What they had been was what I was. I knew it. What they had become I could see with my own eyes. They were clean. They were not in rags. They had no thirst. They were men of joy to themselves, of value to the world, and they had no consciousness of guilt. They had peace. And I was still a drunken outcast, a sinner in rags, dirty, drunk, shirtless, ill. But they had been what I was. They had not lied when they said so. There was hope, then, for me. You see, these men were the living evidence of that hope, and I learned the way of salvation. Again a pause. The chairman leaned forward a little. All the brethren leaned forward, as the climax of this indubitable experience of the soul approached. Someone asked me if I would not give God a chance in my life, a clean, strong, kindly man, who had been what I was, and whom I knew to have been what I was. Did I not care to give God a chance to restore me? Would I not try it? Would I not be prayed for? Would I not pray for myself? I was drunk, still drunk, but I was resolved. I was down and out, I had nothing left, and I went forward to get what these men had, what my soul desired, redemption. It was a logical determination, the evidence of God's activity in the world, of His power and wish to regenerate, had been so convincingly exhibited that no rational intelligence could endure to doubt it. And I was in a position to know the depths from which these men had been lifted, and I knew that only the power and love of Almighty God could so lift them up. And I got up from my knees a new man, a new creature in Christ Jesus. I had been born again. It is not a cant phrase. I used to think so, but now I know it isn't. There are no other words so accurately to describe the change which had occurred within me, no other words to describe the completeness of it, the newness of the life into which I had come, a child in righteous ways. I was regenerated. I had been born again. I was sober. And from that moment I have never wanted alcohol. A miracle, as truly a miracle as any healing ever was. And in every essential a miracle. I have not wanted a drink. Do you apprehend the stupendous change which had occurred within me? I have not wanted a drink since that time. I did want a bath, instantly. But I was too dirty to be given one without precautions, and I wanted a clean shirt. I loathed my rags, my dirty person. I wanted to be clean. How I craved a bath, and pride at once revived, the good pride of manhood. One of the brothers, we redeemed drunkards are all brothers, offered me 5 cents. I rejected it, and with hurt pride. I was no beggar. I was a man again, a gentleman. What did I want of charity? What did I want of a nickel I hadn't earned? I wanted work. First I wanted sleep. I desperately needed a bed. And then I wanted a bath and a job. I had my bath in the morning. What a gracious gift it was. And I got my job, too. And I got my clean shirt. The crisis was past. There was a ripple of nervous laughter among the brethren, which was instantly stilled as Fairmeadow proceeded. But I lay that night in a Bowery lodging-house, he went on. It was a heaven of rest and ease and quiet and seclusion after Solomon's Cellar. I was too dirty to be put in the long room with the decent Bowery rowdies and drunks. I was given a bunk in a section reserved for the worst of us. I was very low, you see. But I was too weak to crawl into bed. They must lift me in. I did not sleep. I lay awake all that night, in tears and prayer and joyous aspiration. My tears were of contrition, my prayers were of rejoicing, of incoherent, unutterable gratitude. My aspiration was towards work and service and self-respect and the love of all men. A wonderful night. A night in which those things which I had once cherished but had long abandoned were restored to me. Hope, truth, love, pure ambition. The things of St. Paul. Whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise. It seems to me now that in that night I travelled back over the long way I had come, that I was once more in the company of the pure things of my boyhood. I was a new creature, you see, in Christ Jesus, and in the morning I stumbled rejoicing to the labour of a new day in a new life, and I was sober, and I was not at all afraid. It was the end. Now, boys, Fairmeadow gravely added, you know why I am here. You know the meaning of such a life as mine, know its significance in a world of men. You know what my work is, too, and whether or not I am called of God to do it, and whether or not I am an instrument well chosen to serve God's purposes in these woods. He sat down. Brethren, said the chairman reverently, let us pray. After that they ordained John Fairmeadow on the spot, and Fairmeadow, when he got back to Swamp's End, had much ado to keep the boys from celebrating the event according to the customs established. Chapter 32 Love and Labour. It was spring again at Swamp's End. The snow was gone, the trails were dry and greening. Balmy winds came over the illimitable forest from the west. All the busy little persons of the woods began to chirp and twitter in vast excitement. There was the flutter of little wings in the underbrush, and there was a noisy chatter in the branches of the big pines, changing to crooning, sweeter calls at dusk. Once more, of a Sunday afternoon, Pattie Batch had the baby, gray-eyed, dimpled little Pattie Batch. Once more dear little Pattie Batch had the baby at the companionable patch of wild flowers on the edge of the woods. A toddler now, that adorable little one, and quite able, too, if you will believe it, to utter with perfect distinctness the sweetest word in all the world. An accomplishment, indeed, hard to be matched in babies of that tender age. It was a gentle day, a blue sky, with ships of white cloud sailing past, high above the forest, bound heaven knew where, but to some joyous event, and hurrying thereto. A soft, redolent breeze flowed into the clearing, where it paused to play with the flowers and sweet grasses, and then off it whisked, in shadow and sunshine, to that self-same joyous, distant place to which the great white clouds were going. It was a day for dreaming, such was the day, the sunshine of it, the tender wind, the new, sweet green, the amorous twitter, and little Pattie Batch was dreaming. She plucked flowers for the baby, she gave him a garland, she crowned him, she put a sceptre in his dimpled hand, and she was dreaming all the while. Sadly? Not at all. The mist in her gray eyes, which presently gathered and fell in two little tears, had no part with melancholy. Not at all. Not a bit of it. Pattie Batch was very, very happy. She would have admitted it had you asked her. John Fairmeadow struck in from the Bottle River trail and came smiling broadly to the patch of wild flowers on the edge of the woods. "Hello there, Pattie Batch!" he shouted. "'Lo, Jack!" "Where's my tea?" John Fairmeadow demanded, scowling tremendously. Pattie Batch pursed her lips. "What?" "It isn't ready?" "Not ready?" John Fairmeadow complained, with a great air of indignation. "Well, well! I like your independence." "When it is time for your tea, John Fairmeadow," said little Pattie Batch, in firm reproof, "you will get your tea, and not a minute before." "What?" John Fairmeadow stammered. Pattie Batch smiled. It was delicious indeed to treat big John Fairmeadow in this masterful way. The chagrin and astonishment which he was quick to feign were really quite irresistible. Pattie Batch smiled. She couldn't help it. And then she giggled, and then she chuckled, and then she broke into a ripple of laughter. John Fairmeadow laughed, too, a great roar of laughter. And the baby, of course, displaying an amazing perception of the joke, chuckled like a cherub. Than which, as everybody knows, there is no sweeter chuckle in the heavens above or on the earth beneath. What with John Fairmeadow's resonant deep bass roar, and the baby's heavenly cachinnation, and Pattie Batch's rippling tintinnabulous cadenza, you may be sure that a fine chord of glee was struck on that mellow Sunday afternoon in Gray Billy Batch's clearing on the Bottle River trail beyond Swamp's End. Presently the afternoon was spent. The shadows were grown long in the clearing, the twitter in the woods had begun to fail, the west was flushing. "Pattie," said John Fairmeadow. Pattie Batch started. The ardent quality of John Fairmeadow's voice was such that "Patience," Fairmeadow repeated. One glance was sufficient for Pattie Batch. One glance into John Fairmeadow's eyes was enough to startle the little thing quite out of her wits. "Ith time for tea," said she, hastily, her lisp overcoming her. "Not yet." "Yeth, yeth." "Not yet," Fairmeadow repeated. "Not until I " "Yeth, yeth," Pattie gasped. Big John Fairmeadow had a sense of helplessness to which he was not at all used. And still continuing in this strange paralysis, he watched and listened, without lifting a finger to help himself, while Pattie Batch snatched the baby from his bed of flowers, protesting all the time that it was time for tea, that it was long past time for tea, indeed, that there wouldn't be any tea at all if she didn't look out, watched and listened, confounded, while Pattie Batch fluttered off to the cabin, calling back that she would call John Fairmeadow when tea was ready, and that he mustn't come a minute before. Here's a pretty pass for a tale to come to, which should have a happy ending. John Fairmeadow brooding in the failing light at the edge of the woods. John Fairmeadow downcast and self-accusing. Poor little thing, thinks he, she's frightened. A mere hint of the thing has frightened her. John Fairmeadow, pacing the patch of wild flowers in grave trouble, called himself hard names. Had he not frightened and distressed the little soul that he loved so much? Why shouldn't he call himself hard names? And what right had John Fairmeadow, sometime Bowery drunkard and outcast, to lift his eyes to this sweet blooming flower of the woods? Regeneration was all very well in its way, but regeneration and new service could not wash a man's past away so that no stain remained upon his honour. John Fairmeadow had asked his God all about it, of course, being a man of that sort, and his God had seemed to approve. But Fairmeadow was convinced, now that Pattie Batch had fled, that he had mistaken the quiet voice in his own heart, and Fairmeadow was ashamed of himself. He would say no more. He would teach Pattie Batch to forget that he had said anything at all. And in this resolve he waited, downcast, brooding and ashamed, for Pattie's call from the cabin. And as for little Pattie, in the meantime, she was having much ado to get tea at all, for the mist in her gray eyes blinded her, and her hands would never do the thing she told them to do, and she could find nothing at all in its place, and the tears just would fall on the toast, and everything, positively everything, was at sixes and sevens in her heart, no less than in her kitchen. Pattie Batch, you see, who had long ago observed the crisis approaching, had resolved and determined not to spoil John Fairmeadow's life, not even if the baby never had a father. "No, by ginger," thinks she, "I won't." Nothing but the dusk and starlight of spring could solve such a tangle as this. A deuce of a job, too, of course. Dusk and starlight came together. Dusk and starlight of spring at the edge of the woods. This was long after tea. Long after John Fairmeadow, in the merriest fashion in the world, had partaken of toast and tears. Long after the baby had been put to bed, too. At a time, indeed, when the mystical powers of dusk and starlight had waxed large and mischievous, John Fairmeadow and Pattie Batch sat on Gray Billy Batch's porch together. The still, sweet dusk had fallen. They looked out over the little clearing, to the black pines and to the high, starlit sky. Presently John Fairmeadow began to tell Pattie Batch of those other days days terrible in memory. And Pattie Batch came closer, closer yet, as the tale of many sorrows was unfolded. Her motherly little heart ached. It was in her heart, perhaps, but to give comfort. But however that may be, and I am not informed, she was presently drawn comfortingly close to John Fairmeadow without knowing it at all. She sighed sometimes. She sobbed a little, too, and always, while the tale went on, she gave a loving sympathy to the teller. John Fairmeadow was unaware. Only the dusk and the starlight knew, and the little stars winked happily at the sight of it all. Nothing was held back by John Fairmeadow. No bitterness of degradation, no depth of sin was concealed. And at the end of the wretched recital, so had dusk and starlight and love worked upon them both, little Pattie Batch was snuggled close to John Fairmeadow, was held close, too, so that John Fairmeadow had no difficulty whatsoever in softly kissing her upturned, tear-stained face. "I love you, dear," said he. "I'm glad," she whispered. "Oh, I'm so glad." They looked away to the pines and stars. Beyond, far beyond, Fairmeadow saw himself walking upright and at work in a world of men, but not now going the path alone, and it may be that Pattie Batch, too, visioned, in the far sky, the glory of her future. "You and I, dear," said Fairmeadow. "You and I, Jack." "Always, dear?" "Always." They sat in this way for a long, long time. both dreaming, both with eyes lifted to the stars, each with a heart of joy. But presently little Pattie Batch jumped up, as though bethinking herself of a forgotten duty. "Jack!" she gasped, "I forgot to tell the baby." Roused from sound sleep, the baby wailed dolorously. It was a stout complaint. "Well?" Fairmeadow asked, when Pattie Batch got back. "He's glad, too," replied little Pattie Batch. Well, 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 all said and done, the thing being told, at last, they go along very well at Swamp's End, Love and Labour. As Love and Labour will, unfailingly, being genuinely joined together. There is no doubting it at all. They are placid companions of the soul, givers of hope and wise counsellors. They are true. They do not fail. They go along very well indeed at Swamp's End. But there is no Mr. Pattie Batch at Swamp's End, notwithstanding all that occurred in the dusk at Gray Billy Batch's lazy clearing on the edge of the big woods. There is no Mr. Pattie Batch, believe me. There is nothing but a Mrs. John Fairmeadow. A rosy, dimpled, twinkling-eyed, shy, appealing, adorable little woman of astonishing capacity, but only a little Mrs. John after all, which, indeed, if the truth were known, she had rather be than anything else in all the wide world. There is John Fairmeadow at Swamp's End, as well as Mrs. John Fairmeadow. Big, beloved John Fairmeadow, who still scolds and beseeches and marries and buries the boys, and who, still right lustily, wields his broom of righteousness in those woods. Big John Fairmeadow, in the measure of his service and in the stature of his soul, a man. There is the little partner, too, lying at ease in the green field near by town. Still tenderly loved, you may be sure, and still inspiring. And there is the baby. Of course there is the baby. There is the adorable one, satisfactorily fathered at last. Still with an unconquered and inexplicable predilection for lumber jacks, as when, on the Christmas Eve of his advent at Swamp's End, Billy the Beast poked a finger at his stout abdomen and excited nothing but a loud peal of laughter. And there's something more than that at Swamp's End. There are 2 babies. End of chapter 32. End of The Measure of a Man, by Norman Duncan.